how can we change the thinking of leaders to understand that collaboration is actually, even for greater powers, much better in the long run. Dag Hammarskjöld said that morals should be an integral part of international relations and multilateralism without being moralizing.
We're here today on the Values and Interests podcast. I'm really honored to be joined by the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, Björn Holmberg. So thank you so much for coming to Carnegie Council.
A pleasure to be here, Kevin. Thanks for inviting me.
Right, so there's a lot to discuss in the world of multilateralism, peace and security, moral and political leadership, and you're at the nexus of that in terms of your role leading the foundation and also your career across these spaces. So I think we're really going to dig into that journey today. For everybody listening, I really want to kind of give you a blueprint in terms of the values and the professional system of somebody who's kind of done this work for decades. And so thank you so much for being here. And maybe we can start how we always do on the Values and Interests podcast, is really digging into your own personal value system. And maybe we can start there and kind of build the blocks from formation of your value system and then kind of work through your career.
Well, thanks for having me here. And of course, this is not an easy question, but one I've been thinking a lot about. What made me come here, and what are the values that drive me? And Dag Hammarskjöld said, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, that the longest journey is the journey inwards. And I think that's how life makes us be in one way, and there's a lot of decisions on that way. And I think if it's on a more personal note, as you asked me for that, I think my parents were really important, being civil servants, both of them. One started as a theologist, the other one as a nurse, and they became university teachers, and they dedicated their whole life, actually, I would say, being humanists, sharing values of everyone being equal. And what I think was important, that in life, in practice, they were walking the talk. They were always trying to empower people. I remember being a small kid that my father brought students home to support them, that they had trouble at home and challenges, and also involved me in that. So I think that was kind of the basis. And I think in a shock that started me, that made me understand that we might be different and have different values, was that when I was, I think, 10 or 11 years old, we got an immigrant to our class, and I was living in a wonderful suburb, but very, ethnically, I would say isolated, a lot of Swedes, so to say. And I don't think anyone was racist, but the difference of someone coming from a complete different culture suddenly spurred a lot of actions and things that I couldn't stand for with the upbringing of my parents. Yeah. So that was the first time, I would say, that I actually had to use words, but also my fists to support and protect my comrade to a certain cost. But it was also, where you had to make that choice of. Yeah.
It's interesting when you're, when I reflect on my own values formation, my mother was a public school teacher for many years. And I draw a direct line to that, right? She could have done other things, but she chose to do that. And she had a massive impact on many people, and including my brothers and sisters and I. It's so interesting when you think about ethics or values or morality, and it feels very complicated, or you can only understand it if you're studying philosophy at Cambridge. But you, as a 10-year-old in that class, were doing applied ethics. You saw what was happening. You were reflecting on what was happening based on your own value system that your parents gave to you. And you knew you had to do something about it. So I think a lot of times in the world of politics or technology, people try to put ethics over here almost as a point of distraction, so we can't actually deal with the issue that is at hand. So it's just interesting to kind of hear about that moment, that formative moment for you.
Yeah, I think that was kind of a wake-up call that we have different values and different understanding of the world, because I don't think it's only lack of values. It was something foreign coming, something not known by many, and then that became a negative reaction. But I think also that was kind of the start. But then I went to Central America as a 17-year-old teenager and lived in Honduras, and I still love the country. I see it as my second country. But then I saw the civil wars in Central America. I saw the lack of gender equality. I saw, compared to Sweden, which was kind of a liberal, gender equal space with a lot of course, challenges, but still different. I saw that the world can be very different from the world where I was brought up, and that interest in understanding, especially why are there wars, and the abuse I saw of civilians and some of the armed forces and insurgents or armed groups that were fighting, made me move from pacifism. I thought of refusing making military service in Sweden during the Cold War in the 80s. To become an officer in the reserve because I wanted to do peacekeeping. So I think that was also kind of a consequence of seeing what war did to social cohesion and people. And that led me in the end to become a peace and conflict researcher, and then working with the UN and aid agencies and civil society to see, what small contribution can I make, being raised in such a privileged context and having friends that have taken so great risks and high cost compared to what I have done.
No, it's interesting to hear about this pacifist to maybe more moral realist pivot and having that epiphany. I think that is at the heart of how we think about international relations here at the Council. And that Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, right? It's this idea that morality and power have to be interacting with one another. You can't put one in a silo because there are traps on either end of the spectrum. So it's interesting to hear that. And, I think what we're seeing a lot right now in terms of political discourse and policy is a belief that you can just go into this amoral realism corner and values are nice to have, but only get you so far. So maybe we can kind of reflect a little bit about that framing and the current geopolitical situation and kind of how you're thinking about that. And I'd love to hear a bit more about your work over the decades as a researcher in peace and security and work, and maybe we can kind of get into that a bit.
I mean, a light reflection from being a former peace and conflict researcher, and actually the first one with a light military background when I started at the department. So that was also an interesting, tension between a department that was rightly created much in the light of the Vietnam War and other perspectives, and suddenly I came as a kind of a new young officer that had quite strong moral convictions of what is right and wrong and how should we contribute to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. In the worst of cases, using arms as a last resort. But I think that what I saw my first semester studying peace and conflict studies was the Berlin Wall fell. And I think no one foresee that, or very few foresee that, the change of behavior. And now we see the opposite. That was kind of the victory of idealism, and now the United Nations multilateralism would be strengthened. We didn't expect it, and then we thought, like Fukuyama said, it was the end of history, that it would, it would continue forever. I sense now we have kind of a discourse which is very gloomy, that things what's happening now would also continue for forever. And I still think about Pinkerton's book about, the tendency about wars over time, that we see we have less and less war in the world, and that this might be a temporary dip. And going back to, you said Morgenthau and so on, if he talked about prudence and responsibility and the interest of the nation, I think that what we've seen is that would learn, I would say, from the time after the Second World War to now, is that multilateralism actually, to a large extent, worked. It prevented a Third World War and a nuclear war. And I think it goes back to what we know from Axelrod, who did game theory. He said that if you have a very transactional, realistic approach, which you have debated in some of the pods I know, that you always want to, win the next round. Axelrod showed us that that tit for tat in the prisoner dilemma game theory is the one that wins. Basically, that you collaborate, and if the opponent doesn't collaborate, you punish that opponent once, but then you try again. And I think that's the core of multilateralism. And I do believe that where we stand now, we will start paying the price, both with which we see more wars, less respect for international rule of law, unfortunately the lessons learned will be that the cost will be too high.
Yeah.
So I think the thing here is how can we change the thinking of leaders to understand that collaboration is actually, even for greater powers, much better in the long run. Huh?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is this transactionalism right now in diplomacy, and that being prioritized as an ends and a means. And there's almost this dopamine hit that the politician gets, that the public gets, and say, like, we got a good deal, right? And really, what you've talked about previously, that's a zero-sum deal.
Game.
In a lot of ways. Somebody won, somebody lost. And I completely agree with you. I think we are going to see a domino effect from this transactional approach. And it's interesting, people are not, no fault of their own, right? The context is not as easy to access now due to what algorithms prioritize in our information ecosystem. So it's a big challenge from a narrative perspective for those that are supporting liberal values and related principles of, I would say, responsible internationalism. I wanted to turn a little bit in terms to the foundation's work and how you think about the mission and the purpose today, some 80 years on from the founding of the UN and from 70 years on from Dag Hammarskjöld's time as SG.
Yeah. I think that the foundation was created in 1962 following the death of the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. And the idea was to continue, his work, in his legacy. And over time, it's been shifting. But for the past 15 years, it's been very much focused on strengthening a constructive multilateralism, which is interesting to say today when we see it actually being weakened. But saying so, we've also focused on having the UN, an effective UN, at its center. So it's multilateralism, but with an effective UN at its center. Not saying that regional organizations, banks and others are important, but having UN as its focus. And I think what we see now is less and less trust between nations. As you say, more and more nationalism and raising interest, much in line with Morgenthau and traditional realists of trying to promote national interest more than collective interests. So I think more and more our work is trying to provide evidence of the benefits of multilateralism, of collaboration, of what the UN can do. And I think also wake the idea not of just speaking about effectiveness of the UN and ultimately, but talking about why did we create the UN from the start? And what can we do, not just the United Nations, but the member states? Because as Dag Hammarskjöld said, the responsibility rests primarily with the member states. It's a consensus-based organization, even though the Security Council is a bit different, that where we know that even though you can have a vote in General Assembly in the Security Council, at the end, the more states that stand behind their people, the more impact you will have of the decisions. So I think for us, it's very much to talk about, I would say first, how you make sure that you have quality financing for the United Nations, that member states pay the bill, but also that the United Nations is much more strategic in the use. And we see fragmentation today between agencies. So how can UN work much more, as one, which was the say of Kofi Annan way back. The second area is peace building, where we see there's and sustaining peace, where there's a huge need today with more conflicts. We haven't had as many armed conflicts since 1945. Trying to strengthen the peace building architecture of the United Nations through dialogues and platform, bringing experts and member states together with UN experts to increase effectiveness of that structure. And third, it's very much for us to try to promote a more effective UN leadership within the UN. And that relates to effectiveness. But I would say that effectiveness is also very much based on what Dag Hammarskjöld said, that moral should be an integral part of international relations and multilateralism without being moralizing, so to say.
Yes.
So we are looking at much like the Carnegie Council, on the tension between the normative erosion happening today when it comes to human rights, democracy, gender equality, And how will UN civil servant, international civil servants,
Yes.
be able to uphold the values of the Charter, the values
Yep.
of the conventions of the child, and so on. And in that we see as a core component, very much looking at Dag Hammarskjöld, the international civil servant. We see civil services being eroded over the globe. And we believe that we need to show to member states why it is important that international civil servants work in the interest of all peoples and all
Yes.
nations, and not in the interest of specific nations. And we see there's a critique of the international civil service, and we're afraid that that retreat will decrease UN effectiveness, working for everyone in the Charter.
So there's a lot there I want to dig into, and I think it's important, especially for the listeners who are not in the UN world, but are interested and have really care about its not just survival, but making sure that it's thriving moving forward. So I think the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about was this kind of conflation of what the UN does and the narrative around it. So we constantly hear about the P5 and their ineffectiveness and the politicization and the inability to get things done, right? And this is mirrored in domestic situations around the world politically, but could you kind of walk our listeners through and maybe kind of bifurcate the P5 side of things, which might feel a bit more performative and stuck to the work that the UN is doing, saving lives, delivering food, medicine around the world, and kind of that narrative there. I really want to kind of hone in on that.
I think that's an excellent question, because I think this, way back, other Secretary Generals have made the same point, that there's so much focus on UN in New York and the Security Council. And we know that the Security Council is dependent on the veto power by the five major powers from the Second World War, the victors of the Second World War. And that means that the less consensus we have globally and among them, the less action or decisions the Security Council can take. And I think that, as you say, overshadows the importance of the United Nations system, because in each country, or not, well, most countries, we have a UN system, a UN country team with a resident coordinator that works closely with the government, with civil society and others, to facilitate, to support development, conflict prevention, whatever reform that could, make that country more prosperous and equal, and leave poverty or whatever the challenge would be. And we don't really see that work. And I think one argument we made at the foundation is that we need to provide, in this age of fake news and non-verified sources, we need to show much more robust evidence of impact. I mean, what difference is the UN doing? And I think now the decrease of, for example, the World Health Program staff with, if I remember correctly, 25%, 30%, actually means civilians and children dying of starvation. Taking that away, I think also the decrease of humanitarian aid when it comes to vaccines, there's a talk about 14,000 kids that will die a year. So if you turn that to say, what has the UN been doing, we can show positive numbers of the UN making a difference. And I think if we go back to Morgantown national interest, the argument here should also be to a lot of Western countries that if you are concerned with migration, remember that investing in the Sustainable Development Goals, investing in humanitarian assistance, decrease the likelihood that people have to flee their homes and move out of their countries. So I think we need to show that collective interest of investing in the world. And that I don't think the UN is doing enough, because we always call ourselves critical friends of the UN. There should be much more monitoring and evaluation and showing evidence.
You don't want everybody to tell you the truth, I'll be honest, but you want your close friends to tell you the truth,
hopefully,
right?
hopefully.
And I think this goes back to the message and the narrative, right? So there's a lot of evidence now, some great research coming out of places like the Metropolitan Group, showing this is in the context of democratic backsliding, that whether it's the Philippines or El Salvador or Kenya, the most effective narrative is one that is values-based. And across cultures, there are certain values that resonate with people, no matter language, no matter culture, no matter tribe. And the tension there is what you talked about before, is how do you deliver a values-based message that doesn't feel almost talking down to somebody, right? Like, how do you get that across the value proposition? And I think that's a big challenge right now, because there are anti-liberal forces in a very strategic way attempting to push back. This is not the same ecosystem politically, information-wise, that it was in 1998 or even 2005. And so I guess at a kind of a geopolitical level, can we maybe talk about your thoughts on kind of the value of pluralism today, the efficacy of liberalism? What are the challenges around that? How can we be pushing back in a strategic way that we don't sacrifice our values in doing that?
I mean, it depends a bit on perspectives, because I think there is a sense in many countries that after the Second World War, the Western liberal idea was pushed on many minor societies, and maybe with outside engineering without national ownership, and that has been one of the core results of research showing that if we want to see development in countries independent and also in democracy, it must be nationally owned. So I think even though we would like to push ideas like democracy and gender equality, we need to think of how we do that, because without ownership you have no change. It could be your own kids, or it could be a nation. And I was way back, I can give you one example, working as National Deputy Director of Plan International Sweden, working on child rights, but especially with a focus on gender equality and girls and women. And many times when we work there on sexual reproductive rights, for example, it was working with the mullahs. It was working with the schools and the structures based on their value system and ideas, and providing evidence of why an early pregnancy would be detrimental for society and the specific girl. So I think one argument here is that we need to bring in values, but do in a very much more humble way.
Yes.
And also make I would say, more the operational argument, aside from the value-based argument, that it actually benefits having this. And then I come back to the principled pragmatism of Dag Hammarskjöld. And I knew you speak a lot about that, of what is a pragmatic idealism or something. Is that we can impose things. And as Jan Eliasson said a lot, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and one of my inspirations as a young PhD student, supporting him when he was negotiating the peace treaty between Nagorno-Karabakh, he always says that we need to look at the world how it is and how it should be. And if we're looking too much of how it should be, we might leave ownership behind. It needs to be a joint process. And I'm coming back to that. We see in development cooperation, or aid, which I don't prefer as a term because it tells you top down, but development cooperation, if we see ownership, we see change. And I've seen numerous evaluation of that. That change must come from inside you as a person, but also as a society.
Yeah, no, it's I fully agree. That's another framework an ethical framework we think about here is, taking the world as it is, but simultaneously having your moral or values North Star, right? And so President FDR talks about kind of like tacking back and forth on a ship, right? And the ability to do that, but knowing where you're going. But there might be some left and right turns and some treacherous waters to get there. I think a lot of times in this zero-sum environment, people don't want to hold two truths as one. So we talked about kind of the criticism of the liberal international order and how things are being done. That is completely true and can be true at the same time that you can accept that there is a level of universality around values, right? This isn't an Eastern or Western thing. Human rights are inherently good and everybody deserves them. And so I think these are the very difficult conversations. Ethics provides a non-political framework to interrogate values differences. And so I think the more we can center morality in a non-moralizing way, it will hopefully help to unlock some additional areas for cooperation in good faith and not just transactional bad faith or without reciprocity. And so it's an interesting moment. I want to get back to the pragmatic idealism of the Secretary General. And so when he kind of takes on the job, and maybe you can tell the story a bit, how he didn't really know he was getting the job and kind of came into it, he had this bold idea to really build up the Secretariat, which is really kind of the civil service, for those who are listening who aren't in the UN, the civil service around the Secretary General. and really put forth this radical idea that national interest and alignment with that wasn't the be-all, end-all of a diplomat. And that was a radically different idea for the time, and something that was needed for a UN that was a bit a bit on shaky ground at the time. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit and how he kind of pushed that pragmatic idealism, but really thought big in that moment.
I think I think he brought as a person. His father was prime minister during the First World War and county governor before and after in Uppsala, and he was a very principled man. He stood up for Swedish neutrality during the First War to such extent, so we had starvation in Sweden because we were locked out from food transport. So he was criticized for being too principled. But he came from, like Dag Hammarskjöld, from a Swedish tradition dating back to the early 17th century of Oxenstierna, who, with the king then, saw that we need to separate the ministries from the agencies, the bureaucrats from the politics.
Interesting.
And since long back we have kind of a framework legislation in Sweden or direction to agencies. So politicians are not allowed, or the ministries are not allowed to take decision in individual matters, but they give a direction. And I think he brought that tradition and what he had from his father. And very much also, of course, I think a moral conviction from his mother into the UN. And when he saw the UN, which was then, in a crisis, there was the McCarthy period in the US, and a lot of FBI agents inside the UN building actually looking for vetting for communists in the UN. And I think what we know from biographies is that he saw that this doesn't work. We need to have an independent international civil service based on impartiality, based on professionalism, that stand up for the charters, we the people, not one nation, one interest. So I think this is one of the key contribution that of course he brought from his upbringing, and that we today, I think, needs to defend when we see national interests also in multilateral collaboration being strengthened, and the role of the international civil service being questioned. So once again, like I said before, we need to ask ourselves, why do we need an international civil service? Why is it good for everyone, and not just being short-sighted of national interest in a transactional way, as we spoke about before?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you look back historically and kind of the threat of nuclear war at the time, and whether you look at the crisis in the Suez or the Congo, as really the framework being any spark could lead to World War III.
Yeah.
Very interesting now. I feel like we're still in that great power competition way a bit. We're shifting back, but the risks are not just hard power risks, like these existential risks around technology, around climate. What we think about is kind of like, what is the moral imperative to take something forward, not just the political imperative. How do you think about that equation now for the UN, for its purpose as a moral imperative, political imperative?
I do believe it, as we do at the foundation, that the UN is a kind of a moral compass. It's a political project, but it's also a moral project. Hopefully, not without being moralist. And of course, that project will be questioned when nationalist interest is on the rise. And that's why I come back to my argument that I think what we need now is less division and more inclusion, that we need to promote dialogue. And that's part of the pluralism issue that you raised before, that the UN should be a space for everyone, even though you disagree on certain principles, because we see now that what we took for granted before, which is actually the UN Charter and a lot of conventions, are not being respected.
Yep.
So you need kind of to reset that compass, and you can't do that being moralistic, but you need to gather actors, you need to show the benefits of collaboration. And I want to give you a concrete example. I think that sometimes we can't go to the central issues that are at the height of international conflicts. It could be Israel and Gaza, or it could be other issues. We need to think of areas where we can actually come to an understanding. And in 2023, if I remember correctly, Rena Lee, ambassador from Singapore, negotiated with her team within the UN framework, the High Seas Treaty. Just a year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, And when relations between the P5s were really, frozen, she still managed through dialogue to get them to put other things aside and focus on the high seas where there were actually common interests.
Yep.
So I think what multilateralists need to show now is that we can do things that benefit everyone, and hopefully with time, you create some kind of a resilience of the system to show that the UN can be relevant and multilateralists at large in so many other areas. And what I'm afraid of actually when it comes to climate change or war, and even nuclear war, or lack of arms control right now, and the increase of investment in nuclear arms, is that we know from organizational theory and research and psychology that man and woman, you should say, learn best from their mistakes, and that it's usually generational. And the generation that fought the Second World War is not active anymore, and we are short-sighted.
Yep.
So
and the cycle kicks off again.
So the risk here is that we're going to have to go through detrimental changes, and a nuclear war or passing too many of the tipping points of climate change means that we might not have a second chance. So this comes back to being I would say a pragmatic idealist, or whatever we would call it, like Dag Hammarskjöld was, is to know how the world is, but work on it how we would like it to be without being moralist, and showing the benefits of collaboration, hopefully avoiding very hard learned lessons. I think that's key. That's why we are promoting dialogue as an impartial actor, never impartial on the morals, but between the actors.
Yep.
So that's key for us.
Yes, no, it's ethical realism in practice. Yeah, it's a very difficult time in terms of what you talked about, where it's kind of this generational proximity. And I've talked about this on the podcast previously, but I was born in 1989. I knew my grandparents who fought in World War II, and so I had that generational memory ingrained within me. And even for people who are 10 years older than me, the norms of U.S. politics have shifted massively. That generational proximity isn't necessarily there. And I'm not saying my experience was better or worse than anybody's, but there were serious consequences from lessons not learned in the 1930s and 1940s. And so I know there's been a lot of thinking about that in terms of what these cycles of lesson learning look like. And I think that's an important, to talk about narratives a bit more, that's a really important narrative to really, lean into and unlock that, the wisdom or the lessons learned, so they're not forgotten.
No, you're right. And I'm thinking about when we come back to Morgenthau and other, political realists, and now we see possibly more transactional realism, which is more short-sighted, is that one of the things we know from peace and conflict research, aside from democracies don't fight war with each other, now we see that democracy is on decline. Which is a real negative trend. We also know that the security dilemma is one of the strongest drivers of conflict within nations, but also between nations. And realism, per definition, means that you will increase the sense of insecurity of your opponent, and we know that from the arms race in the first Cold War in the 1950s. We know that from the missile race. We know that from so many. And now we see a large shift away, especially from Western countries, in investing in sustainable development goals. Towards armament and war and prevention, which actually is not really increasing the sense of security, but decreasing the sense on all sides. So we need to shift that narrative. You can fully understand the need for national defense. I would not say otherwise. But the problem is when you get a vicious circle, that the security dilemma is actually making us invest in a very unproductive sector, which is the military means. And I'm a former infantry officer captain in the reserve, so I know what I talk about. I'm not saying you don't have the right to defend yourself, but what's happening now is that we're strengthening this security dilemma. And I think then you come back to the importance of the UN, the importance of regional organizations like the African Union, the Organization of American States, to provide both formal and informal platforms to decrease the risk, of escalation, but also hopefully over time creating much more sense of community and collaboration.
Yeah, I think one of the moral risks in the increasing securitization of the international relations space is that you create different tiers of people or human beings, right? And we're seeing this playing out, right? Whether it's Gaza or Ukraine in terms of civilian deaths, children being taken, children being killed. For the sake of security, you can excuse or make a moral argument for doing a lot of things, as we've seen in history, and we're kind of lost to that proximity of history of the 30s or the 40s at this point, and we're seeing some of these terrible things play out again. So I think from a universality of the human condition, from the equal moral worth of everybody, we're starting again to see a bifurcation of that. And so that trend line concerns me massively, especially as we see the increasing budgets on the hard security side and decreasing budgets on the global aid, global development side of things.
No, I think you see a disregard of international humanitarian law and international law, which is really concerning. But I also ask sometimes what happened after 9/11, which was a horrible event, for the U.S. and especially the New Yorkers and those living in New Jersey and so on. But it also, something happened there in 2001 that human rights was put aside on the hunt for terrorists, and I think that's partly when the West started losing its moral imperative.
I completely agree.
And we need to think about, what's happening now, what leadership do we have, and what values do they stand for? Because what we assumed were given values in the UN Charter and the Human Rights Convention, so is now, more based on, well, if we have interest aligned with these values, we will promote them. Otherwise, national interests come first.
No, I think a red line was crossed. We talk about kind of assuming a moral mask for an immoral means or end, and you saw that not to be a U.S. bashing, but I think going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of what is going to be the knock-on effect of an increasingly transactional approach to foreign policy. We don't know that now. But I'm willing to draw a pretty straight line in terms of where we are in the U.S. politically right now and internationally to the values red lines that were crossed in response to 9/11. And it's interesting, again, my generation, there is a very clear bifurcation of pre-9/11 world and post-9/11 world. And in a lot of ways, working here at the council, now I'm able to see that not through my own personal experience, but also in terms of values at the U.S. level and the international level. And so I feel that from a U.S. leadership perspective, we're kind of seeing another one of those moments play out. We're not going to understand the effects of that until 10, 15, 20 years from now, but there will certainly be an impact. And that's why we need organizations such as the UN that are values-based, that do take a pragmatic approach, while still understanding that two things can be true at once, that there needs to be serious retooling to the system now to make sure we can move forward. So maybe we can kind of close with that and turn more into a positive light, into kind of channeling the Secretary General, channeling the mission of the foundation. What would be your pitch to kind of go all in right now to multilateralism, and what would be your message to those listening?
I mean, I would say that we know from history that collaboration, like the Axelrod research example, tit for tat, to collaborate is much better for everyone, including great power. So I think what we need to see now is first of all, a UN member state investment in the ongoing reform of the UN aid initiative launched by Guterres, the Secretary General. And I think also to trying to understand the benefits of collaboration and create those spaces, because we have now a tendency of excluding because of global tensions and geopolitics, to keep those channels of dialogue open. And as I said before, I think also for the UN, and that has been raised now in one of the parts of the UN initiative process, to invest much more on providing evidence of the impact of multilateralism. If it's so for humanitarian assistance or arms control or peace building, to show that it's worth, because if we look at the cost of the United Nations, I think 3 years ago was 76 billion US dollars. It's the same as the turnover of Pepsi Cola in 1 year. We're not really investing much in multilateralism. So when we talk about a non-effective UN, first of all, of course, the UN can become more effective, but it's not a large investment we are doing. And I think we also need to see that, as you have made the argument too, is that the UN being a moral compass and being that also political project for pluralism globally, we can't just talk about effectiveness without talking about norms. We know that norms also make things work better. For example, national ownership, we know makes development cooperation much more effective. We know that gender equality is, I would say, almost a precondition for national growth, because otherwise you're excluding half of the population from the productive sector. So I think you need to be that pragmatic realist to show that there are actually benefits to collaboration. The High Seas Treaty that Lena Lee and her team ran is such an example. And that transactional realism or being short-sighted will cost us all. I think migration, I gave you another example. So I think to show that collective action can make a huge difference, then of course we all should demand that the UN is a much more effective entity, but then also the member states needs to provide conditions for the international civil service. Because the more they push for national interest and having their own candidates independent of merits, the less effective the organization will be. And in the dialogues we try, of course, Chatham House rule with high-level UN staff and member states and so on, we hear that there is a huge need of reforming the UN within when it comes to civil service, to make it much more innovative, to like, I know you're working at the Carnegie Council, to engage young people, that they see they can make a career as an international civil servant. In the interest of all peoples, not just one nation. So I think a bit of more of vision, a bit more of trying to understand other perspectives, which is pluralism, and maybe being a bit pragmatic. We have to accept sometimes that some nations might not be able to be very vocal on gender equality because of national domestic conditions. So be a pragmatic diplomat, be a friend that sees that we are at different stages, if it's whatever we would say, if it's the beginning or the end or and so on.
I think the trap to always fall into is, loving the sound of your own voice, right? If it's only virtuous and valuable to you, then what have you accomplished?
Yes,
right?
no, you're right.
So I wanted to maybe just actually end on this question, which is more of an open one to yourself. So, you're the expert, you've been working in this space for decades. So anything that maybe I didn't ask that you feel you want to touch on, especially for my listeners who are really kind of interested again in this pragmatic, idealist, ethical, realist approach to international relations, maybe anything that we didn't touch on.
Well, maybe I can go back a bit to Dag Hammarskjöld.
Yes, that'd be great.
Working at the foundation.
We need examples. We need examples of moral leadership.
Yeah, but I think looking at him, he was very clear on he was acting as a civil servant, as the highest global civil servant, and he was acting with impartiality between the actors, but not neutral on the morals. You can be a pragmatic idealist, is possible, and I think we can learn from that, and that there's not a dichotomy between effectiveness of multilateralism of the UN and norms. They need to go hand in hand. So that's one thing, and I also want to say that I think we get stuck, as we said, a bit in the narrative of our generation. And as we look at the world today, it looks like things are going the wrong way. If you have a more liberal perspective on gender equality and democracy and so on. And of course, when it comes to war and climate change. But we also know that there are trends over time. We've seen that poverty in the world has decreased over years. Violence has decreased. We have kind of a dip now, but we are so short-sighted sometimes. We think this is the end of days. We are living, in the most pivotal moment of history. That's each generation saying that. And I remember the Kaiser of Austria-Hungary before the First World War, when he saw a car driving through and he was on his horse. He said, "That's a thing that will never evolve. Horses you can never change." We're so stuck in our history. So I think listening to Dag Hammarskjöld or seeing what he did, he entered the UN in 1953. if we recollect how the world looked like in 1953, it was the last year of one of the most violent post-1945 wars, the Korea War, with tremendous losses of lives. We had a lockdown in the Security Council. We had a weakened United Nations that was penetrated by, basically a communist hunt with a very weak civil service. And still, he had the courage and the moral compass and the pragmatism to turn things around. He engaged in the Suez Crisis in '56 and was, instrumental in actually, preventing things going even worse. He was able to negotiate with the Chinese to liberate the American pilots. He did a lot of things that you would never think were possible in that age, and I think you can still see a UN, you can see multilateralism if we have more courage and if we have also more accountability from the member states of investing. And even though he had the resistance from some member states, including the P5, the Permanent Five, he got through the first peacekeeping operation, UNF-1, in '57 by using the General Assembly. I mean, there are some spaces in the
famous
charter.
Story of dip the helmets in blue paint.
Of course. And I actually carry around the UN Charter, and I opted not to go for the blue one.
Oh, very nice.
but the yellow one, like a star shining. We need to reread it. We need to follow its advice, and we need to think about we the people.
No, I love the
like
branding.
Dag Hammarskjöld did.
Yeah, we can't let it ossify. We need to. It needs to shine in front of us.
It needs to shine in front of us. Yeah. So I think Dag Hammarskjöld can show us that even in the gloomiest times, you can be an actor. If you're a citizen, you can engage, on social cohesion, on international development cooperation, on democracy, whatever. If you're a international civil servant, you know that even though your days are tough, and that's one of the topics for us, that you stand up for values, and that you're supported by the organization, the UN, is central, because otherwise the values will vanish. We need to keep them alive and take risks, not being risk aversive.
Yeah, no, we need a values-based, a pragmatic values-based community. It's almost too much to ask of any person to be on the values island by themselves. So the more there can be a community, again, in a pragmatic way that allows you to do your job, get back to the world, but really stay true to your value system is incredibly important. And just a plug, because I would say the Secretary General is maybe less known to kind of the American audience now. We talked about proximity to history. I'm going to close to have people to go look into the foundation and go look into its legacy a bit more. So after Dag Hammarskjöld's tragic death, John F. Kennedy actually made this very famous statement, quote, where he said, "I realize now that in comparison to him, I am a small man. He was the greatest statesman of our century." So this is who JFK named the greatest statesman of the century. So I encourage my listeners, watchers, to really dig into the mission of your organization and the value system of the man to kind of take lessons and move that forward now. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me here. A pleasure.